Hundreds, if not thousands of golfers make this huge mistake when buying golf clubs. And if you're one of those golfers, you're going to cause yourself some pretty big problems next time you're out on the golf course. And that problem is all to do with loft. And speaking of loft, loft is going to have a huge effect on gapping. Why not hit the subscribe button down below and fill a gap in your golfing knowledge so you're best equipped to play your best golf? Let's get back to the video.
So one of the big issues we see is because there's no industry standard on lofts, sets tend to be quite loft specific. So pitching wedges and every other club in the bag tend to get a little bit stronger. So generically people will go, I need a gap wedge, and they'll go a 50 or a 52 and then cycle up from there without actually correctly yardage gapping. So you'll find a pitching wedge could be as strong as 44 and then the next wedge will be 50. So there's a huge gap there. I think the important thing to remember is that there's no industry standard when it comes to lofts. You'll have specific lofts for a set within a manufacturer. Different manufacturers' lofts will change as well. So when you're buying new clubs, whether they're wedges on top of the back end, you need to understand what your lofts are and where the next club is going to fit in that set. Bearing that in mind, it's paramount to get fitted. If you're a keen golfer and you're serious about your golf, go and get fitted. Go and get yardage gapped, because you need to ensure that every club in the bag is doing a specific job that it's designed to do, and you've not got multiple clubs doing the same thing.
So what problems will that cause with gapping at the end of our bag where our wedges sit? Firstly, I have 3 golf clubs in my hand here, all stamped with a P on the bottom signifying pitching wedges, and they all have a varying loft on them. And as we go from the older to the newer, one thing that is happening is the lofts are getting stronger. And what problem will that then cause with gapping? Well, the biggest problem that we may face is actually the amount of wedges that we now have to carry. From the Mizuno Tezoid True iron set, what we did see that it simply went pitching wedge, sand wedge, lob wedge. There was 3 wedges in the bag. With the new JPX 925 and what we see from a lot of clubs now in this sort of lineup of the game improvement distance model, we see very strong pitching wedges, 42 degrees for this club. So what that now means, if you were to just buy a gap wedge like I have, a 52 degree one, and put that into your bag, thinking, well, it's pitching wedge, the next one we go to is gap wedge, you've got a 10 degree gap there. And what that will now mean is that you have a significant distance gap when hitting both of these clubs full. I actually hit some shots in the studio here, and you'll see the distance gap between the pitching wedge of each one. The yardages are getting further and further away as we go from the older club to the newer club. And the problems that this might cause at the bottom end of the bag is that we have massive gaps between the pitching wedge to our next wedge. And what we're trying to do at this end of the bag is be very specific and pinpoint accurate about the distance we're trying to hit it, as opposed to trying to create maximum distance. We're trying to control the distance. And you can see this from more of a player's type like iron in the S3, that the distance gap got a little bit closer. Yes, it's still a strong pitching wedge compared to the true 44 degrees, but we're seeing that that gap gets a little bit more uniformed. So you have to ask yourself, when looking at the pitching wedge in your set and the other wedges in your set, how many wedges do you actually want to carry? Because there's a couple of problems that you might be faced with because of the pitching wedge. One is the distance gap between the pitching wedge and your next wedge. Is it too big? Are you able to hit the smaller 3/4 shots with the pitching wedge, which I know that a lot of mid to high handicappers aren't that comfortable with doing? Another problem that it also causes is the shots around the green. If you're going pitching wedge and then maybe to a 56 degree wedge, you're going to have that massive gap, and you're going to have one that in a pitching wedge you might be trying to play more of a low bumpy run shot, but because of the stronger loft it comes out a little bit fiery. Your next club then being the 56 comes out a little bit too high, so you've not got anything in the middle there. Also, another issue that you may face is because if you've bought a club to fit into the set that you already have, you might be duplicating lofts. One of the biggest things that I usually see from students is that they have a pitching wedge in their set and they have a sand wedge in their set that's somewhere around 55 degrees. We then see either a 56 being bought or a 58, which is too close. We see a massive gap from pitching wedge to the next wedge, and then we see a very small gap in the club between the sand wedge and their next wedge, i.e. a lob wedge. So you've got to have a look at what those loft gaps are and how far each of those clubs are going, because you could have clubs that are taking up space in the bag that are doing the same job, where you could be filling it with a club that actually needs to fill that big gap that you've already got. Now we know that you might be having 4 wedges in your bag. What effect is that going to have on the gapping at the top end of your golf bag? Let's take a look and find out. Now, looking at set makeup, if we agreed that you have 4 wedges in your bag, that's 4 clubs gone. We then have to have a look at how many irons you're going to have in your bag, because if you go from 4 down to 9 iron, that's 6 clubs. You've now used 10, and if we all agree that you're going to have a driver and a putter, that leaves us 12 golf clubs, which means you've only got 2 spare spots, and the distance that the 4 iron is going compared to your 3 wood leaves a big gap. But are you skilled enough to fill that gap with just 1 club in something like the hybrid? Well, one positive of this is that we're not seeing lots of 2 irons and 3 irons in play anymore. They were very hard to hit, those clubs, generally with smaller heads, and the loft being what they were at, they were just troublesome. And we see the invention of things like the hybrid now coming along, which you can put into your bag. But are you going to be able to get one of these in the bag if you've got 4 wedges? Let's take a look at actually what the distances are of the clubs from yesteryear to where we are now, and how we would then fill the gap. Now, as we know, there is no industry standard, but if we were to look at a 4 iron of years gone by, the loft of the 4 iron would have been around 24 degrees as standard. If we take a look at what the average game improvement 4 iron is now coming in at, that is 19 degrees. That's already a massive gap between 2 clubs there. In fact, the actual 6 iron of the game improvement set is closer to what the old 4 iron used to be, these coming in at around about 26 degrees. So what does that mean for the set makeup when we look at the top end of the bag? Now with this, it all comes down to personal preference, and also that question that Al said, what is each club's specific job? Because as well, do you actually need a 4 iron? Could you start your iron set at 5 and then maybe have an extra hybrid in the bag? Because, as I mentioned earlier, with the introduction of hybrids, they're a lot easier to hit than the long irons. We've done videos in the past where we look at things where the 3 wood is actually getting close to the driver as well. So is that a club that you need? This is where, with there being no standard industry loft anymore, it's created a lot of issues in gapping. And as you, as the golfer and the consumer, we have to make sure that the clubs that we're putting in the bag fill those gaps and have a specific job. And I guess what it comes down to is having these 3 bases that I'm going to share with you, that when you are going to buy new golf clubs, you have these covered. These are non-negotiables. The first one is knowing the distance of your current golf clubs. Because if we know the current distances, we're not going to buy a golf club that matches any of the clubs we have in our bag, rendering it pretty much pointless. Secondly, when looking at the top end of your bag, distance gaps are paramount here, and also some versatility. Think of where you're going to be using these clubs. These are going to be used for second shots on par 5s, long par 4s, even par 4s. If you're struggling with distance, you need something that can be used off the fairway, out of the rough, and even off the tee. Don't buy 2 clubs that are going the same distance and doing the same job. Try and cover those bases. And when we're looking at wedges, let's make sure you haven't got huge gaps between your pitching wedge and your next wedge, and also that you haven't got too tight a gap between some of them. 56, 58 is the common one that I see. If you cover those 3 principles when buying golf clubs, you shouldn't see too much gapping issues and should get the clubs that are right for you. Fitting is paramount when doing this. And why not check out a video here where you can see my full fitting from my latest irons. Thanks for watching, see you soon.